You're standing on the dock, checkbook in your pocket, and the boat in front of you looks perfect. The teak glows in the afternoon light. The listing swears it's blue water ready, one owner, lovingly maintained, but under that shine, something is already waiting to cost you $30,000, and the broker smiling at you knows it. Here's what I found after walking more boatyards than I can count. The sailboat that carries you across an ocean for 30 years often costs less up front than the pretty one that drains your savings in 3. The difference is not luck. It is evidence that 90% of first-time buyers are never shown, and I've spent years reading it off hulls, invoices, and survey reports. There's a batch of one of the most respected offshore sailboats ever designed, hulls built between 1976 and 1981, that hit a defect so deep it blistered from the inside out. Most buyers still don't know how to spot it. I'll hand you the exact trick at the very end. I remember kneeling in the bilge of a Tayana 37 in a gravel yard outside Annapolis, my flashlight catching a brown stain running down a bulkhead that the broker had cheerfully called just a little cosmetic weeping. It wasn't cosmetic. It was the boat telling the truth while the paperwork lied. That moment is why I do this. So let me walk you through 6 boats and the honest way into one that actually lasts. Let's start with a number nobody says out loud, because it changes everything that follows. When you buy a used cruising sailboat, the purchase price is not the cost. It's the deposit on the cost. I've watched men celebrate finding a solid 36-footer for $40,000, then spend the next 2 years quietly pouring another $60,000 into it before they ever left the harbor. That's not a horror story. That is the median outcome, and the industry has a strong interest in you not doing this math before you sign. Here's the framework I use, and it's brutally simple. A cruising boat costs you roughly 10% of its value every single year just to keep it alive and floating. On a $50,000 boat, that's $5,000 a year in slip fees, haul-outs, bottom paint, insurance, and the small deaths of 100 fittings. That number holds whether you sail her hard or let her sit. A boat that sits actually rots faster, which is the cruelest joke in this whole business. Now stack the big-ticket replacements on top of that yearly bleed. Standing rigging, the wire that holds your mast up, has a service life of about 10 to 15 years, and replacing it on a 37-footer runs $8,000 to $14,000. Sails, which everyone forgets, are $3,000 to $7,000 for a decent cruising suit. A diesel repower, when that faithful old engine finally lets go, is $15,000 to $25,000 installed. These aren't maybes. These are appointments already on your calendar, whether or not the seller mentioned them. So the real question was never, what does this boat cost? The real question is, how many of those appointments has the previous owner already paid for, and how many are they quietly handing to me? A boat with fresh rigging, a recent repower, and new sails at $70,000 is dramatically cheaper than an identical boat at $45,000 with all of that looming. But the listing shows you the price, not the appointments. Therefore, the entire game is learning to read the appointments before you pay for the price. And that reading starts with knowing which hulls were built to survive the decades in the first place. Let me show you the 2 boats that prove the point, because they sit at opposite ends of the reputation spectrum, and both are misunderstood. Start with the Westsail 32. Sailors love to sneer at this boat. They call it the wet snail, a slow, heavy tank that plods along while sleeker boats leave it behind. And it's true, she's no racer. But listen to what that heaviness actually is. The Westsail 32, built mostly through the 1970s out of California, came out of an era when builders didn't yet trust fiberglass, so they used far too much of it. The hulls are absurdly thick, hand-laid solid glass, in some places over an inch at the waterline. That flaw of being overbuilt is exactly why these boats are still crossing oceans 50 years later. Here's the part the sneering crowd leaves out. You can buy a sound Westsail 32 today for $30,000 to $50,000, and the hull itself will likely outlive you. What you're really buying at that price is time and structure. The money you save on the hull is money you can pour into the systems that actually wear out. I've crawled through Westsails where the original hull was flawless, and the only real work was rigging and an engine, the exact appointments I told you about. That is a boat that lasts decades if you go in with your eyes open. But not every heavy old boat is built the same way. Therefore, you cannot buy on reputation alone. Consider the Cape Dory 36, drawn by the legendary designer Carl Alberg and built in Massachusetts. Alberg boats have a devoted following for good reason, with their full keels and sea-kindly motion, and the Cape Dory hides one enormous advantage most buyers never think to check for: an encapsulated keel. Instead of bolting a lead keel onto the bottom of the hull, the ballast is sealed inside the fiberglass itself. Why does that matter to your wallet? Because bolted keels have keel bolts, and keel bolts corrode, and a keel bolt replacement, or a keel that develops a smile, that ugly crack where the keel meets the hull, can cost you $5,000 to $15,000 to properly address. An encapsulated keel sidesteps that entire failure category, but it introduces a different one, and here's where you earn your savings. If an encapsulated keel ever takes a hard grounding and cracks, water gets into the ballast cavity, and now you've got a saturated keel that is miserable and expensive to dry out. So on a Cape Dory, you're not checking keel bolts. You're on your knees with a flashlight, looking for grounding damage and moisture at the base of that keel. Different boat, different appointment, same principle. Know exactly where this specific design fails before you fall in love with it. Because falling in love is the trap, and it gets far more expensive when the boat has teak on deck. Let me take you back to that Tayana 37 in Annapolis, because it's the perfect teacher. The Tayana 37, designed by Robert Perry and built in Taiwan starting in the mid-1970s, is one of the most produced true blue water cruisers in history, with well over 600 hulls built. That's a gift, because it means parts, knowledge, and a huge owner community. It's a genuinely capable, beautiful ocean boat, and I don't want to talk you out of one. I want to talk you into buying the right one. Here's what glowed on that dock and rotted underneath. Many Tayanas came with teak decks, hundreds of individual teak planks screwed and bedded down over the fiberglass deck. When they're new, they're gorgeous. When they're 40 years old, every one of those thousands of screw holes is a potential path for water to get into the deck core. That brown weeping stain I found on the bulkhead wasn't cosmetic. It was rainwater that had been tracking through saturated deck core and running down inside the boat for years, quietly turning the balsa or plywood core to black mush. Now, hear the number, because this is the one that ends marriages. Removing an old teak deck and repairing the wet core underneath on a 37-footer routinely runs $20,000 to $40,000. I have seen quotes cross 50. That single issue can cost more than the entire purchase price of the boat. And the listing photo that sold you? It showed the teak at its most beautiful, in raking golden light, specifically because that beauty is the bait covering the most expensive failure on the boat. So does that kill the Tayana? Not at all. It just means you buy the one where a previous owner already tore off the teak and glassed over the deck, or you buy at a price that assumes you'll be doing that work. The Tayana that lasts decades is out there, but you find it by pressing on the deck with your body weight and listening for the soft, spongy give, and by pushing a moisture meter across every square foot before a survey. The one you avoid is the one you buy in golden light without ever getting on your knees. And knowing that a bad deck can cost more than the whole boat naturally raises a darker question. If the deck can hide that, what else is hiding? And why has nobody made you check it? That brings me to a boat built by people who seemed almost obsessed with not hiding anything, and to the moment I want to stop everything and talk directly to those of you who already own a boat. The Pacific Seacraft 37, designed by Bill Krelock and built in California, is what happens when a yard decides to overbuild on purpose in the modern era. These boats used vinyl ester resin in the outer layers of the hull long before it was common, specifically to resist the blistering problem I keep circling toward. They hand-laid their hulls, backed their hardware properly, and it shows in the resale value. A Pacific Seacraft 37 holds its price like almost nothing else in this class, which tells you the market has already figured out what's underneath. You'll pay $80,000 to $140,000 for a good one, and that premium is real because you are buying appointments already paid and failures already engineered out. That instinct, that willingness to look where you're told not to, is exactly what separates the buyers who thrive from the ones who get buried. And it matters even more with the next boat because this one hides its money below the waterline. If everything I've just laid out, the appointments, the hidden failure categories, the danger windows by hull year, feels like more than you can hold in your head on a dock, that's exactly why I put it all into a book. True Cost, Deep Water, and Cast Off are available in the description below, and they're built around one idea. You deserve to read the evidence before you write the check. Every boat discussed in this video, every inspection method, every year range worth flagging, is in there in a form you can bring to a boatyard and actually use. If you're serious about not getting buried, those books are the next step. Now, if you already bought your boat and you've been listening to all this with a knot tightening in your stomach, I need you to stay with me right here because this next part is built specifically for you. You don't need a broker. You don't need to spend a dime, and you can do this the next time you're aboard. I want you to go find your chain plates. Chain plates are the metal straps that anchor your shrouds and stays, the rigging that holds your mast up to the actual structure of the hull. On most cruising boats, they run down through the deck and bolt to a bulkhead or a knee below. They are the single most under-inspected life safety item on a used sailboat. And when one fails, the mast comes down, sometimes taking part of the deck with it. Here is your free inspection. Go below and find where each chain plate passes through the deck or attaches to a bulkhead. Look for a tea-colored brown stain bleeding out around it, or a bulkhead that looks water-darkened at the top. That staining is crevice corrosion and water intrusion talking, and it means the metal you can't see may be quietly cracking where it enters the deck. Then run your fingers around the deck fitting and feel for any lifting, any cracked sealant, any weeping. If you find rust streaks, staining, or a soft bulkhead, you don't panic, but you do get those chain plates pulled and inspected before your next real passage. Replacing chain plates is a few $1,000s. A dismasting at sea is your rig, your deck, and potentially your life. You just performed a check that most owners never do until the failure does it for them. And I promise you, once you've felt for that tea-colored stain, you will never walk a dock the same way again. That instinct, that willingness to look where you're told not to, is exactly what separates the buyers who thrive from the ones who get buried. And it matters even more with the next boat because this one hides its money below the waterline. The Island Packet Line, built in Florida from the mid-1980s onward, is beloved by the retirement cruising crowd for good reason. Shoal draft, roomy, easy to sail short-handed, and they used a proprietary hull material and foam coring that resists the core rot problem that plagues those Tayana decks. On paper and on the dock, an Island Packet 380 looks like the safe, sensible choice, and often it is. But every design makes a trade, and the Island Packet's trade lives in its systems and its complexity, not its hull. These are boats loaded with gear, refrigeration, pressure water, extensive electrical systems, roller furling, the comforts that make liveaboard cruising pleasant. And every one of those systems is an appointment. I've seen buyers so relieved by a dry, sound hull that they completely forgot to price the aging refrigeration compressor, the tired house battery bank, and the deck hardware that needs rebedding. A full house battery replacement with modern lithium runs $4,000 to $8,000. Marine refrigeration repair or replacement, $1,000 to $4,000. Rebedding, leaking deck hardware and ports, $1,000 to several thousand in labor if you can't do it yourself. None of that shows in a hull survey that comes back clean, and a clean hull survey is precisely what lulls people to sleep. So the lesson stacks up. On the Westsail, watch the rigging and engine. On the Cape Dory, watch the encapsulated keel. On the Tayana, watch the deck core. On the Pacific Seacraft, you're mostly watching your bank account handle the premium. On the Island Packet, you watch the systems. Each boat lasts decades, but only if you know which appointment it's going to hand you. Therefore, the honest way into a boat that lasts is not finding a boat with no problems. It is finding a boat whose problems you've already identified and priced. And that finally brings me to the sixth boat, and to the people who profited from what you weren't shown. The Valiant 40, designed by Robert Perry, is one of the most revered offshore sailboats ever created. It practically invented the modern performance cruiser, a boat fast enough to actually sail well but strong enough to cross oceans, and Valiants have circumnavigated the globe more times than almost any production boat you can name. If you asked a room full of experienced cruisers to name the great blue water boats, the Valiant 40 comes up every single time. And that reputation is exactly what makes the buried defect so dangerous, because it hides in plain sight behind a legendary name. Here's the case. For a stretch of production, Valiants were built by a yard called Uniflight in Washington State, and somewhere in that run, roughly the hulls built between 1976 and 1981, the boats were laid up using a fire-retardant resin. That resin, it turned out, was chemically unstable underwater over the long term. These hulls began to develop severe, deep blistering, not the cosmetic surface pimples that plague a lot of old fiberglass, but extensive, structural-looking blistering that erupted across the hull below the waterline. Boats that were otherwise brilliantly designed and beautifully built carried a chemical time bomb in the very resin holding them together. Now here's what enrages me, and what should enrage you. This is not lost lore. This has been documented for decades. Independent testing publications like Practical Sailor have written about the Valiant blister saga at length. The affected year range is known, the cause is known, and yet these boats still change hands, and buyers still walk the dock, dazzled by the Valiant name, without anyone in the transaction volunteering which hulls fall in the danger window. The seller doesn't mention it, the listing doesn't mention it. Everyone downstream of that original resin decision has an incentive to let the legend do the talking, while the year of manufacture stays quietly out of the conversation. Understand what happened here, because this is the pattern across the entire used boat world. A builder made a materials decision under cost or regulatory pressure. The consequences showed up years later, long after the warranty and the original buyers were gone, and the knowledge of it got pushed to the margins, kept alive by obsessive owners and independent testers, while the sales machinery kept polishing the reputation. You were never meant to know which specific hulls to fear. You were meant to see the famous name and reach for your checkbook. The blind spot wasn't an accident. It was inherited, and it was convenient for everyone except you. But here's the beautiful part, the part that turns this whole thing around. A blistered hull does not mean a dead boat, and it does not mean you avoid the Valiant 40. Some affected hulls were peeled, dried, and rebuilt properly, and a professionally repaired hull can be sounder than an untouched one. What it means is that you must know, before you spend $1 on a survey, exactly which hull you are standing on and exactly what to look for. And that is the trick I promised you at the very beginning. So let me hand it to you now, because this is the piece that pays for the whole video. Every fiberglass boat built in the United States since the early 1970s carries a hull identification number, a HIN, molded or stamped into the hull, almost always on the upper starboard corner of the transom, the back right of the boat as you face it. Most buyers glance at it as a formality, like a license plate. It is not a formality. It is a birth certificate, and it will tell you the truth the seller won't. That 12-character code isn't random. The first 3 characters are the manufacturer's identifier, and the last characters encode the date of manufacture. On boats built under the older system, the final characters tell you the model year and the month the hull was actually laid up. You can read right there on the transom with your own eyes whether the boat in front of you was born inside a danger window. For a Valiant, you're checking whether that hull falls in the Uniflight resin years, that late 1970s stretch. For any boat, you're confirming the true build date against whatever the listing claims, and I have caught listings off by 3 and 4 years, always in the direction that flatters the boat. Then you combine the birth certificate with 2 checks you can do in 10 minutes on the hard when the boat is hauled out. First, the knuckle test. You wrap your knuckles across the hull below the waterline, listening for the change from a sharp, solid tap to a dull, hollow thud that signals a blister or void beneath the surface. Second, you look and feel for blisters directly, those raised bumps in the gel coat, and you note whether they're a scattered few or a widespread rash. A handful of small blisters is a cosmetic afternoon. A hole covered in them on a boat built in the danger years is a peel and rebuild job that can run $15,000 to $30,000. And now you know that before you've paid a surveyor a nickel. Bring a cheap moisture meter, the kind you can buy for $40 to $80, and run it across the hull below the waterline. High, saturated readings across large areas confirm what the birth certificate warned you about. This is the entire method the industry counts on you not having. Read the HIN to date the hull, cross-reference the known danger years for that model, then knuckle tap, eyeball the blisters, and meter the moisture. You just did, for free, in 15 minutes, the single most important screening that separates a legend from a liability. That knowledge existed the whole time. The builders knew it, the testers preserved it, and the sales machinery buried it under the fantasy. Now it's yours, and you can carry it onto any dock this weekend. And there's one more layer that turns this from a repair problem into a total loss of your dream, so don't leave without it. Insurance companies have quietly gotten strict. More and more insurers now require a recent survey and rigging under a certain age before they'll write a policy on an older boat, and some flatly refuse hulls past a certain age or with unresolved moisture issues. So a boat you buy blind, with a blistered hull and 30-year-old rigging, isn't just an expensive repair. It can become a boat you cannot insure, which means a boat you cannot keep in most marinas and cannot legally finance. That is how a $50,000 dream becomes a $50,000 anchor you can't get rid of. The HIN check and the rigging age aren't paperwork. They're the difference between owning a boat and being owned by one. Here's the truth I wish someone had knelt down and told me before my first survey check ever cleared. The boat that betrays you is almost never the ugly one with the honest problems. It's the beautiful one whose problems were kept just out of your sight behind a famous name and a photo taken in golden light. You now know how to make those problems show themselves before they cost you your savings. If you've read this far, you're already a different kind of buyer than the man who walks the dock and falls for the teak. You're the kind who checks the transom, feels for the tea-colored stain, and asks what year the resin came from, because you'd rather know the truth standing up than learn it going down. That instinct is going to save you tens of thousands of dollars, and maybe a lot more than money. So tell me this in the comments, and I read them. Which of these 6 would you actually put your savings into? The overbuilt Westsail 32, the Cape Dory with its encapsulated keel, the Crelock-drawn Pacific Seacraft, the Tayana with the teak deck gamble, the Systems Heavy Island packet, or the legendary Valiant 40 if the HIN comes back clean? Drop the name and one reason. I want to see who's really been listening. And if you've already bought one of these, tell me what your survey missed, because someone reading needs to hear it before they sign. If you're done being marketed a fantasy, and you want the evidence before you risk the nest egg, this is your crowd. Subscribe and stand with the buyers who investigate before they trust, who open the bilge and read the birth certificate instead of the brochure. Because next time, I'm pulling apart the diesel engine question everyone gets wrong, the exact hour count where a marine engine stops being a bargain and starts being a repower in disguise, and the 1-gauge reading that tells you which is which before you ever start it. I found the number. Be here when I show you where it hides. I hope this saved you from one expensive mistake, but I stopped just short of the part that matters most. Inside the honest harbor, I pick up right where I left off. You can ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You'd be joining first-time buyers just like you. So, you're never alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen and cancel anytime. One click. No risk.